okay if I take my jacket off? It used to. I mean, when I joined IBM, it was dark. It was very clear what you wore. It was a dark suit. It was white shirt, and the coat would be buttoned. There'd be no question. The coat would be buttoned when I would be speaking. I was really hoping to be across campus at the press conference announcing me as the new head football coach. It pays quite a bit. Yeah, it pays better than IBM. I guarantee that. But that's okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate. I appreciate you all being here. When Mark and I were chatting about this your course, I call you Dr. Vainey here.
Whatever makes you happy.
I get answered a lot of things.
They call me a lot of things.
I understand. He talked about the book you were reading, and I had not read this book. And so I went out to Amazon and dutifully found it. Actually, it's one of their partner companies. Partnering is something I'll talk a little bit about with IBM later about what we're doing as part of our transformation. But I had not heard of Paul Carroll. I did remember, I think, some of the things he had written in the Wall Street Journal because I try to read the journal as often as I can. But I have to tell you, it was I lived through this period, and it was humorous and it was painful reading some of the things that he talked about here because I lived through that. In spirit of, I have some notes here to make sure I don't forget some things. I joined IBM in 1980 in a sales role. I was a salesman out of our Jackson, Mississippi branch office at the time. Sales at that time at IBM, sales was what most people thought about IBM. And sales, we were very sales focused. We were very product focused. I think some of that came out of the book. But we were a very product oriented organization. We had multiple product organizations. And I think you may have picked up on some of that. Mostly the mainframe was discussed in the book, but we were in many cases competitive with one another, and that was by design. I'm in a business now. I'm in a unit called our Global Business Services. I'm in a part of IBM that didn't exist 27 years ago. 27 years ago, we were in the consulting business. We were in the systems integration business, but it was mainly with the federal government. It was mainly with literally doing NASA-type related activities, or automating the Social Security Administration. It was not working with commercial clients, commercial businesses. So I am going to talk a bit. I'll make some comments on a lot of my discussion will be around the transformation of things that I've seen. Ground rules. You can ask me anything you want to ask me, and I would encourage you whenever you have a question, just raise your hand, and we're going to stop there and take the question. I want to make this interactive. The idea is not to save the questions to the end. The idea is you don't have to be overly polite. I will not disparage any of my competitors. I will not disparage any of the people that were written about in the book. I did not work directly for any of the people that were in the book. I was a really low-level guy. I was a salesman, but most of this was going on, and in sales management. But I'll be candid with what I know. And if I don't know something factual, I'll call it out as such, and I'll tell you what I know, and I'll tell you what I think, but I'll label it as such. So, any questions before we get started?
I don't kind of understand. What's the difference organizationally between change and transformation? You use transformation term about 5 times in a single time you mentioned change. Why?
Well, I guess I'll look at transformation as significant change. I'm not going to get into the nuances of either, but transformation in our case wasn't an incremental change. It wasn't let's tweak the organization, let's change who's operating this or change the org structure. By the time this book ends, we were bleeding. And I'll show you some charts here to show you how much we were bleeding. But we were bleeding a lot of cash. We were losing market share, and we were in serious peril. And so by a transformation, I mean major systemic change that the organization had to undergo to survive. That was our case. That was our case. Okay, so yes?
Could you also explain what is the main activities of the company now, as opposed to?
Can we hold that for a bit? I will talk about, I'm going to comment throughout this what our business was like, and I also want to come and actually have a couple slides on how our business has evolved. And if you have questions about that, please answer. Please ask me that. As you read through the book, and I finished reading just last week, just after Thanksgiving. So as you read through the book, I would like to hear from you some adjectives, don't have to be long sentences, but just words or a brief couple of words on how you would describe IBM from the book that you read. This is where you don't have to be polite. You can call it, say whatever you want to say. Robert? Bureaucratic. Okay. Bureaucratic. I'm sorry? Redundant. Okay. Resistant.
Very policy driven.
Very policy driven.
Inefficient.
Arrogant. That's the word I was looking for.
Most profitable and most admirable in the world.
At times. Yeah. That's right. Any other words? Arrogant's a good one. Set in our ways. Yeah, definitely. Very insular. If you looked at before Lou Gerstner, who came on the scene in April of '93. In fact, I stopped this morning in Tupelo and saw an old friend of mine who used to work for IBM, and he was in the third wave of cuts. When somebody came into their office and said, basically 70% of the office, you no longer have a job, here's your package to leave. But up until Gerstner, every CEO had been promoted from within. It started off in the sales ranks. Some had Ivy League pedigrees, some did not. Okay. Any other words that would describe you'd use to describe IBM as it impressed you as you read the book? Short-sighted. Yeah. John Opel, who was the CEO preceding John Akers, he had forecast, and I forget the year he said we were going to do this, but said we were going to hit $100 billion in sales. Now, last year we had 92, 93 billion in sales, so we never hit that number. But one thing that we did was that we built manufacturing capacity to be a $100 billion company, basically on the back of the mainframe. So short-sighted. Okay. Other words.
Well, you look at the Gerstner book, you could say elephant.
Elephant, that's right. Teaching the elephant to tap dance. I only heard him speak once in public, and it was really toward the end of his career. He talked about, on the point of whoever said, I think a couple of people said bureaucratic. He talked about how tough it was to get things done inside IBM as the chairman and CEO. Okay. Good. Well, I wanted to kind of get that framework. I want to give you another word I want you to think about. And now, I'm not here to give you a rah-rah sales pitch on IBM. That said, I'm very bullish on IBM. I've been here 27 years. I've had a number of different jobs. I think it's a great company. We've had some very painful times. We've had our heads handed to us with some very painful lessons. But I'm proud of the company I work for. I'm proud of the business that we have. But my job is not to give you a rah-rah sales pitch. And if you think that I am, please let me know that. But hopefully I'm going to be as factual and let you know what's going on. Oops. I'm going to use the clicker here. I want to just start off with a slide, and I'm not going to read all this to you. But one word I want to give you that you didn't mention, and you're probably going to laugh at me when I say this word, but one word I want to give you to think about as you to describe IBM would be the word innovative. None of you gave me the word innovative. I heard arrogant, heard bureaucratic, short-sighted. I mean, I just maybe want to kind of leave, so you don't be polite. But you didn't hear the word innovative, and often you don't think of, certainly from a lot of what was written in the book, you don't think of innovation. Throughout the year, I don't know if you know this or not, but IBM actually got its start, back in the early part of the 20th century, and we made things as varied as time clocks and meat scales. A lot of time and attendance type clocks you'd find in businesses. It was once known as the Computing, Tabulating, Recording Company. Our founder's a guy named Thomas J. Watson Sr. His son succeeded him as the CEO in the 50s. And Watson came from NCR, and he had an interesting past. But it's a lot of those things. These are things IBM invented organizationally. I'll call your attention in 1935. IBM has been very progressive in hiring women, not into clerical clerical ranks, but into professional ranks. We had, I think this is a picture of a group of systems engineers that we had in 1935, which was somewhat of an innovative practice from a product standpoint. And I'll tell you, we have been a very product-focused company for most of our career. Very product-focused company. At the beginning, I think at the very beginning, we certainly have listened to our customers and responded to our customers with what they needed. We did a lot of work with the Social Security Administration back in the 30s, and there's some other innovations that are product-oriented. But I think what you read in the book, as we became more and more successful, and we became more and more insulated, and we found ourselves as a company that we had all the answers. And by the way, all the answers happened to be IBM. And if you came from somewhere else, particularly as I read, and I didn't really, I remember when Estridge, kind of came on the scene and the PC was announced. And frankly, I remember there was a product called the Data Master that we sold, that we were competing against the PC. And we had very product-specific sales training on how to compete with the PC. Now, right now, if I told you a PC was $5,000 or something, you'd say that would be crazy. What you could buy for today, go to Best Buy, and what you could buy for $5,000. But that was phenomenal. It was a phenomenal price for that type of technology at the time. So $5,000 for an IBM PC with a couple disk drives, no hard drive, right, Brian? And monochrome monitor compared with the Data Master for about $30,000 or $40,000 that we were selling. And we were telling the customer that we knew what was right for them. And so that came out pretty loud and clear. But if you look at some of the history of innovation that IBM had, where we really did listen, we innovated, in office equipment. We lost our way in office equipment, but the Selectric typewriter, you'll still see some around here, probably on campus, but they had a little called an element, which is a little ball that was easy to take off. You could change the type style very, very easily. The System 360 in 1964, this was when Watson Jr. was the CEO of the company. He literally, I believe it's Father, Son, and Company is the book that Thomas J. Watson Jr. wrote. If you really are interested in it, you might want to read that. But he literally bet the company on the technology that was associated with the System 360. It's hard for us to imagine at this point in our lives, but until the System 360 came on the scene, every time IBM or any of our competitors would come out with a new set of technology, you have to write all new software for it. You change the operating system. And Watson declared with System 360 that if you buy this technology and you write software for this product, for successive technologies that come out, you'll never have to rewrite your software again. And so we've had Systems 370, Systems 390, and other names follow on there, and you would not have to rewrite your software again. And so, but he bet the business on that, and it was a bet that paid off, and IBM showed innovation at the time. Some of the work that we got in our current business, and I'm going to talk about what Gerstner came in and did, but Gerstner put us on a track to be able to go and solve customers' problems, business problems, and be a solutions-focused company. And early days, we started off, particularly NASA is an example of that. We did some of the guidance system work for NASA, not too many miles from here. A lot of that work was done over in Huntsville, Alabama. Huntsville, Alabama at one time had thousands of IBMers living there. And this was a case where I'm told a colleague's father who actually was doing some of the work, but he literally, the federal government NASA came to IBM and said, go write me a guidance system. Something, there was no competitive bid. It was go do this. And so I'm told that's how it happened. But we literally put men on the moon. Of course, if you look at the technology that any of you have in your Palm Pilot or your BlackBerry or certainly your laptop, it far exceeds the technology that it certainly had in the early days. But again, innovation that was done there. Innovation through, we have some Nobel Prize winners in science. Certainly the innovation that you read most about, and we read most about in '81 happened with the personal computer. And really it happened because you had a guy named Estridge and a few other guys who really sold, I think it was Frank Carey at the time, that, you know, there's this new thing we ought to go do, and for us to go do this, how do we go do it? What did he do? What was creative about the approach that they used? What do you remember that they did? Standardized. What about IBM organizationally? How did they develop the PC?
On the road, they kind of let them get away from bureaucracy of IBM.
Yeah,
Skunk Works.
it was a skunk work. That's exactly what I was thinking. It was a skunk works down in Boca Raton, Florida. And they got this little group, and there was, we were talking about corporate culture a little while ago. There's this enormous force of corporate culture going against them to go do that, because that's not the way we've done things before. And you started seeing cases of that. I mean, they developed that in spite of, in the face of the overwhelming corporate culture. That why do we need this toy? Because it was really viewed as a toy there. And we certainly have seen the case of what happened and the juxtaposition in the marketplace. You know, Microsoft was this, you know, this small little company that no one had heard of. I was doing, in anticipating this discussion today, I went and just did some search using Google, my favorite online tool. It's probably one of yours as well, and looking at antitrust information on antitrust cases. Now, IBM, for the first part of the career I was in until the middle 80s, we were under something called a consent decree. This was imposed, this is before you were born, this was imposed upon IBM back in the 50s, going back to the 50s, when the government was concerned about IBM being a monopoly and monopolistic practices that they said that we had. And we literally controlled, particularly after the 360, really controlled the mainframe marketplace, no doubt about it. I don't think he had any. I think he may have had some information in there about gross profit margins, but the profit margins on the mainframe were like the profit margins of the modern day software business. They were very lucrative, and they funded a lot of other things at IBM, including the development of the PC. You've seen some other things up there. Certainly there was, in 95, the group that I was with was formed, IBM Global Services. But, you know, and I'll talk a little bit about the changing natures we get of our businesses. But, you know, one business that, you know, we sold some of our chip businesses. But one of the things you probably don't know, if you've got a PlayStation 3, or if you are shopping for a Wii for Christmas, or you have one, or you have a Xbox or Xbox 360, the chips that drive those are all from IBM. And so that's a very specialized business that we're in right now, which is very niche-oriented, very specific to the needs of a Sony or a Microsoft for those products. So it's very, very different from what we've been in before.
Just one question. All that you present here is product innovation. On the other side, I always have recognized IBM as capable of talent management. I mean, all of it, how did such a bureaucracy manage to maintain top quality talent and their motivation to innovate?
That's a good question. I mean, how did IBM manage to keep top talent? You know, if you look at IBM, some major areas we had, just think of our research and development. We had, my perspective is we had a research and development organization that was given significant resources. It was a budget of probably $4 to $5 billion a year to do pure research. They were able to attract top talent in that organization for all types of research interests, without a real regard for how applicable will that research be to a product that's sold in the marketplace.
Like a university.
Very much. It was my perception was very academic setting without regard for what's the marketability of what they're working on. And that's from that aspect of it. IBM has had a history of being a very good place to work. Going back to the 50s and even early 60s and mid-60s, in large IBM communities, particularly in upstate New York, towns like Poughkeepsie and Binghamton, towns maybe you have heard of or you haven't heard of, there were country clubs owned by IBM for IBM employees. I mean, when you had a job with IBM, it was considered a job for life, as long as you didn't kill someone. Literally, as long as you didn't commit a felony, you had a job for life. And so it was considered a good place with competitive pay, hiring above average people, maybe some exceptions here, but hiring above average people. And so there's some of that mental stimulation. So I think it's a combination of things. Overall above average wages, above average benefits, health care and so forth. So I think it's a combination of things, depending on where you work. Let me ask you, anybody in the room, I know we have another number of MBA candidates and as well as faculty, anybody ever work for IBM? Anybody have any family who works for IBM?
What they work for IBM?
Doing what kind of role?
I don't know. She worked out of Jackson. She sold stuff in the late 80s, early 90s.
Okay. Who was that?
Monday Briggs.
Yeah. Okay. So out of Jackson would be every town, every city, towns like Jackson, towns even like Tupelo, Memphis, Birmingham, would all have an IBM location there. Some very small. You'd have IBM customer engineers, guys who would go fix things when they break. Guys and gals. You'd have salespeople. Then you'd have certainly other locations like in Raleigh or Binghamton development organizations. So just curious if we had any.
I had a second cousin who sold mainframes back in the 60s.
Did you?
And he retired on Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga.
Yeah.
Was in sales. I've seen pictures of the blue suit, IBM pen.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think he had the Alcoa or Coca-Cola TVA contract.
Well, I was about to say, because TVA was big out of Chattanooga, and also Tennessee Eastman, used to be Eastman Kodak and Tennessee Eastman up there. But yeah, they probably still buy a lot of mainframes. By the way, I'll tell you, fast forward, we typically sell out of mainframes every year. Literally, our manufacturing capacity. The mainframe is far from dead. I mean, it's been reborn a number of times, but not that you're going to go buy one and put it in your dorm room or put it in your apartment. But I think we'll get into that. I think clients, customers have decided that certain equipment is optimized for certain types of processes. For example, if you're running a large bank, you're running a large insurance company, you're not going to do this off a network of PCs networked together typically. And there's reasons why you do that. Here's just some history. If you're in an MBA class or in the business school, you probably care about some of the metrics. Leading up into the middle 80s, if you look at where we were, revenue-wise, net income-wise, stock price was at an all-time high. It had split. Now, you get a second cousin who sold. So back in the 60s, the stock price was into the hundreds and split many times. We at our height, and I believe when John Akers was, at the time he retired from IBM, we were somewhere around 420,000 employees. And so we had we were really sizable. By the way, we're probably at about 320,000 now. So we dipped way down from 420 and come back up from 320. The mix of employees, the jobs that we have, the types of skills that we have, very different from what we had back in the middle 90s. So we were on a very positive trajectory here through the middle 80s, and you saw a lot of that. Let me say other comments that we had. We were really we were very product oriented. When I joined IBM, we actually had three basic divisions. We had an office products or an office equipment division. So you sold typewriters, you sold office products equipment like we have probably called a display writer, which was a word processor, which was really a PC optimized to do word processing type functions. Copy machines. Then you had the General Systems division, which sold mid-sized products. A lot of those were written around a programming language you probably never heard of called RPG and RPG2. Then you had the mainframe, the data processing division. Those were the big iron guys. Those are the guys who thought they ran the company, and because they did. The profit margins out of the mainframes drove business, but that was big iron. We were characterized by a topic, a point that was made here earlier about full employment, job for life. Basically a job for life. And IBM prided itself even through the Depression, through some cycles of ups and downs, had full employment, never laid anybody off. So you think about a company that had its origins back around 1906 from that first slide until the mid-90s, it never laid anybody off. You've been a person named, a guy named John Akers, and just because he was the guy in the seat at the time, and Yale graduate, all-star IBM sales, Navy pilot. He had been successful at everything he'd ever done. So you think about it's on your watch when all this starts to happen, and all this starts coming to unravel. Interesting. I mean, I can only imagine what that must have been like. Must have been something like being a Division I football coach or something. Not winning SEC games. It's, here's a trajectory that we're on. That's going to change, right? That's going to change. 84. You couldn't hear enough good things about a lot of companies. We weren't the only one. Fortune magazine is telling you, this is looking at the date, you just look at the graphics, you know it's an old Fortune magazine, but you know, IBM was continually on the most admired list. IBM and a number of other companies. For a number of years, we were in the top 5. Tom Peters made a lot of money with his buddy from McKinsey writing about most admired companies. IBM was in here, very best run companies, and it wasn't just that our products were successful, but it was all. If you look at all the business metrics, very successful, business metric wise. If you look at the way we treated employees and those attributes, very successful and significant growth. And but it wasn't to last. And so I think you didn't see this chart in your book, but you certainly read about this. So what happened with the wheel? What are your thoughts? What are your comments about your observations for when literally the wheels were starting to come off? What did you see in the book? Like reading between the lines. What did you see there?
Too slow to market.
Too slow to market? In what respect?
Well, there's two things. One, they wouldn't anticipate customer desires. So by the time they build a laptop, customers actually wanted a notebook, right? And they beat the market by compact in those areas. And so they're also too slow. Their argumentative system had slowed them down. It served them well when technology wasn't moving so fast in the 50s and 60s. But that argumentative system buckled things down to the point where they'd be slow to market in comparison to Microsoft or Compaq or HP.
And exactly right. So one of the keys to the attributes of success, or when we talked about creating the PC back when I had the slide and showed 1981 the PC came out. I asked you how did we do that? And you said we had a Skunk Works down in Boca Raton, Florida, so a nice place, to do something like that. They didn't see the light of day that much. So what happened after some period of time with the PC? Brought it back into the mothership. And I do remember Phil Estridge and his wife being killed in that plane crash. There was a horrific plane crash. It was the Delta L-1011 that went down to Dallas. Have you ever heard the term wind shear? I mean, it was a massive. It was horrendous when that happened. But the product had been brought back into. Phil was really out of that at that point. I think that the product had been brought back in, and so I'm not looking for the name of the person who was managing the PC and the product then, but what were some of the attributes of that person? What were the people? What were the skills of those people that were now managing the development of PC?
After Don Estridge?
Yeah. And I'm not looking for a name because I know Cavino came at one point, but
Well, Cavino was after Bill Lowe came back in.
Right.
Bill Lowe had proposed the PC to Kerry.
right. So the point is, I was trying to pull out was these were all mainframe guys basically. These were all legacy IBMers that had developed mainframe applications, that had developed mainframe hardware and products. Long development cycle. By the way, product life cycle of a mainframe 5+ years. And what's the product life cycle even then of a PC? Somebody besides Mark Bing answered the question. What do you think the product life cycle was in a PC? I don't know what it is now, but
Maybe 5 years.
5 years, a lot less.
Less than that.
Yeah, a lot less than that. I mean, down into probably maybe a year. That's okay. At least you answered right.
Well, the other thing was they tried to stuff the genie back in the bottle and tried to go back to the IBM proprietary architecture days and to build in switching costs for their customers, not recognizing the huge changing marketplace that they were in, the exploding open systems marketplace. They thought they could just keep doing it the way they had always done it, and they didn't see that things had changed.
You know, IBM missed the market. IBM missed, you know, you saw, it reminded me of IBM's initial investment in Intel, and that we'd had to really get them going, and we've done that, you know, with some other companies, and just, you know, really missed it. But, you know, it was, the perception was so strong that the mainframe, you know, there may be momentary blips in time, that our business is going to continue. So really missing the market, that the market had really shifted. And the market had shifted, and we just didn't know about that. Now, in all fairness, and we missed some other cycles too. There's a most of you aren't even really aware of the technology probably that was referred to as a mini computer. I know some of you are. We were late to that market as well. The AS400 was a product mentioned in your material, but there are several companies that made people very wealthy and made some stockholders very wealthy that were in the mini computer market that were really devastating IBM that we competed with for a number of years that, by the way, no longer exist. Data General, one that I think was a phenomenal company. And these were all out of Massachusetts, but Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC, which was ended up being, you know, bought by Compaq, which of course got folded into HP. But IBM actually did the AS400, which is a mini computer, is actually still lives today. The name's been changed, but it's still a very successful system. One thing I will tell you, the reason it was successful in the beginning and still successful, we'll touch on this a little bit later about, I think part of what Gerstner brought to IBM that we actually got partially right before he came on was the idea of partnering. And the idea of you can't do everything. Part of IBM's arrogance was, and you could probably find lots of reasons why, examples of how IBM was arrogant. Part of our arrogance was we thought that if we didn't do it ourselves in our own product development labs, it couldn't be any good. You know, we really dismissed Intel. We really dismissed Microsoft. You saw that pretty clearly, as well as others, as being, you know, guys, we should really, you know, all the goofiness that you read in the book about, you know, refusing to have meetings or refusing to meet halfway around, you know, across the country for a lunch or a breakfast. A lot of arrogance there. But the point here is in the financial metrics where it was really, you know, was hurting us was all across, certainly revenue, stock price. You know, you look at the net income, and then, you know, the number of employees that we ended up shedding, close to 250,000 from so it's closer to 400. Yes.
The problems which were explaining related to IBM, it really wasn't just particular of IBM. All of the manufacturing in the United States, they had the same problem, the same arrogance. They lost market share. Some of them failed, some of them late. But all had the same problem.
Good point. And even some of our traditional competitors have been severely marginalized. A lot of our traditional competitors were Hitachi Data Systems, and they're still around, but not in the same form they once were. Amdahl made what's called plug compatible mainframes. Basically, it was a mainframe that could run IBM software.
Even car companies. I mean that all type of manufacturing in the United States.
And if you look, if you go on to this slide here, which this is a painful slide, but I remember this article. I remember this. But if you look at who is pictured with IBM in this slide, you have General Motors, Sears and Roebuck, and IBM. And let me ask you this: outside of tools, who shopped for clothes? Yeah, who shopped for clothes at Sears recently? Okay. Some of you may have bought a General Motors SUV, but you know we know what's going on. Continue with General Motors. We know what's going on with Sears. So you're right. There were a lot of very traditional companies that missed the market. You know, it's also mentioned in the book. There was criticism, plenty of criticism for everyone, but there was criticism for IBM's board of directors, and being a hand-picked club of the CEO. I'll submit to you, not to be overly harsh on the IBM board of directors, but if you look pre-Enron, so that's not too many years ago, Many boards of directors were very similar. They were very, they were handpicked organization, handpicked groups by the CEO, part of the CEO's club. And it's going to change. If you go back and look, I don't know, has anybody gone to look at the IBM website? See what the makeup of the board looks like today? It's not something I used to spend a lot of time doing, but I don't get paid to do that. But I went and looked and anticipating that. And I know there's one board member who came, the longest serving board member, I think came on board in '95. No one predating 1995. All the rest you see a lot of 2002, 2003, 2005 that came on. By the way, some previous board, very bright, capable people, but no longer.
Well, I think what's interesting about this downfall, especially with respect to the PC, going back to who took it over after Don Estridge. Don Estridge, I think the book makes the point, was very iconoclastic, right? Was black sheep, right?
Yeah. Very
different type of person at IBM. And afterwards, I don't think it's saying anything negative about anybody, but then Bill Lowe, when he took it over, he started using a process at IBM which had always worked in the past. You know, why should we use it again? And there's a set effect that happens when there's a technological advancement or changes needed in the industry. It's hard to see that because it's forgivable in the sense he's using a culture and a process which had always worked in the past. Why shouldn't it work now? And
that's a good point. And we had a history of success, and there was no doubt. One thing I want to also mention is that part of our history, and I think it comes into our cultures and values, and I'll talk a little bit more about values later because it's very much important to us. Some of this has roots, we chatted about this at lunch, some of this has roots back to when we were concerned that the government might be breaking us up. But when I started with IBM, every year I'd be given a document by my manager who would sit in an office very near, as close to me as that window, and I'd have to read it, sign it, acknowledge that I read it, and give it back to him or her at the time, called our business conduct guidelines. And by the way, 27 years later, I still have to read a current version of the business conduct guidelines and electronically sign off on, and my manager sees, and to ensure that every employee signs off on that. This is part of our culture, and it's part of our shared values. If you go out to the IBM.com website, a lot of information out there, but if you want to go read about IBM and the investor site, you can read about, you can actually download a copy of the business conduct guidelines, but it really guides the way, the guiding principles on how we operate. And as an employee, the things, the guidance that I have, now it doesn't get down to say my particular job function, say, okay, these are the 10 things you need to go do today. Hopefully they've hired people that go figure those things out. But this is the framework in which we operate. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you the story now because I don't want to forget it. But we are, as we've really changed our business, and we are much more of a services-focused company now than just a product-focused company. By the way, we still are very technology-focused. We're learning a lot of new things in this world. We have in the business consulting area that I'm in, we're very project-driven. The work that we do for clients is all project-based, whether it is doing what you might call management consulting, where we're looking at some of their business processes and just giving them advice, or if it is implementing a software package that they bought, like an SAP or an Oracle or a PeopleSoft, something like that. We were doing a project for a mid-sized client in the U.S. within the last couple of years. I'm being vague, just I don't remember the exact date. Within the last couple of years, and it was a blended team. We had a group of people who were a small team, probably 10, 12 people. Some naturalized, U.S. citizens. We had a project manager, one of the key project leaders on the team was from India, who was on site, and we had a contractor from India who was on site. Part of our culture, now you may laugh when I tell you this, I mean, you probably wouldn't have to be told that bribery is not the way you do business, in the U.S., or most businesses do not do business by issuing bribes. Bribery is a way of doing business in some parts of the culture in India. It was part of the culture of two of the individuals on this project team. And one of the project leaders was extorting money from one of the subcontractors on the team said, if you don't pay me money, I'm going to give you a bad project evaluation. You may get fired, and you'll go home, and where your family still is in India, and you'll be shamed, and you'll lose your job. And so this guy was paying extortion, and finally told somebody about it. And we investigated it and found out. Again, this is all clearly laid out in our business conduct guidelines. Again, intuitively, most of us would know you don't do business this way. But the guy who was our employee was terminated because, and because it's the right way of doing business, but also, as we were talking about, it's has potentially a severe impact on the project and running for our client. And I'm not sure if the client ever found out. I don't think the client ever did. We were able to keep it from them and manage it ourselves. But the changing nature, talking about culture, the culture in your organization is not going to be static. It will be changing over time, particularly as you start involving other cultures that are different from Western culture that we were used to. Something that we've learned a lot about. As I read this quote, it was like I don't know if this ever happened with any of you, but one of your parents ever catch you doing something wrong, or a teacher. Now I know it never happened here. But like maybe you come to class unprepared and you're caught, and you know you're not prepared. I know that would never happen anywhere. But what's even worse is when it's true, and you know it's true, and how painful that can be, and how painful this was because it was true. We had lost our way. We had clearly lost our way as a business. We weren't the only one. We weren't the only one who had lost our way, but it was a very visible falling.
But I did not get the point why IBM lost its way early in the 90s. I mean, it had been arrogant for 40 years and it worked. I mean, what I see really happened in the 80s was Japan incorporated and huge deregulation. All of a sudden, the basis of competition was shifting from organizational effectiveness, where the Japanese all of a sudden became big, to innovation and high level of innovation. So in early 90s, there was a major change in the environment, unprecedented, given by huge level of deregulation that started in 1986. And evidently big companies are simply not prepared to change that level. And the radical level of change that was required, simply they did not have the framework of experience how to organize.
Well,
change.
One thing that we find, and we see continuing today, but clearly then, there was a time when there was this great mystery around this thing called information technology. I mean, it wasn't even called information technology; it was called data processing and other things. But there was this great mystery, and the grand wizard that held the tools. I mean, it was like Dumbledore and Harry Potter. I mean, he had all the tools, and he held many of his constituents at bay in that centralized IT organization. If you wanted something, you had to go through that. You had to go through that person. The buildup of the DEX, digital equipment, and the data generals, and the Wangs, and those companies. Those were companies that were very successful because they were selling business computing to. By the way, they didn't go see the CIO, the IT director. They went over here to see the VP of manufacturing and talk about a manufacturing product development problem. They went over to see the sales executive and talk about a Salesforce automation problem or Salesforce management problem, and they started offering specific solutions to their problem, and they were bypassing IT. And IBM, we were calling on our buddy in the IT organization, and that was part of our problem as well. Lou Gerstner, how did the book characterize Lou when he came in? What comments did it have? What did it say about Lou? Anybody?
You made eye contact. Sure, go.
Anybody remember what he said? I mean, I'm not looking for a verbatim quote, but just how they characterize Lou Gerstner. IBM's choice of a CEO named Lou Gerstner. Did Carol think, hey, this guy is the right guy? he is the guy that's going to bring IBM back. Is that the tone? Is that the
What is his
sense?
background?
What was his background? He was a Dartmouth engineer, Harvard MBA, youngest McKinsey consultant to make partner. Prior to IBM, he had run American Express, or at least a piece of, I'm not sure he ran the whole thing, at least a piece of American Express. He came to IBM from RJR Nabisco. So he sold cigarettes, he sold cigarettes, he sold, he was a consumer guy. I'm sorry, Oreos. Everybody likes Oreos. Who doesn't?
The transition to mainframe is quite straightforward.
It's a direct line. It's a direct line. So do you think the market? Look, okay, he's done American Express. So he's done credit cards. He's done in financial services. He's a whiz kid, highbrow McKinsey partner kind of a guy. He's done Oreos and cigarettes. Natural choice for IBM, right?
But he knew business. He knew what capital markets required. He understood that without organizational management change, all of the product changes.
Well, and I think to sell books, you can if you have to be a little bit provocative, and to sell magazines and things such as that. Most of us didn't know anything, and from a culture standpoint, those of us, almost if you think about this, you saw on the previous slide, we had gone from close to 400,000 employees down to about 250,000 employees. We had basically a no layoff policy, so nobody ever lost their job from at IBM unless they wanted to leave. We had multiple cuts, and so you'd be looking around, and all of a sudden you didn't see your friends were no longer around. If you really looked at the stages of grief, and to be serious, if you look at the stages that someone goes through with grief, the people who left were going through a grief process. The people who remained, we were going through a grief process. So it's easy to look back now and say we were arrogant, we missed the market, but it was tough. It was hurting, and there was upheaval in the sales organization because at one time we had 2 rows of people covering the sales territory in Mississippi. And now we have one guy here. We have Jason's now covering the sales territory, and Jason's freaking out because he's getting people calling him with problems. Fix this on this. My invoice is wrong. What do you mean I'm getting charged for this? Who are you? By the way, I don't know who you are. And so those left behind it was culturally tough. It was very tough. So this is where Lou walks in, and certainly, I remember hearing him speak literally a couple months before he left. He didn't speak a lot to internal audiences. He really did not. He brought to IBM, and what he said was, he said how difficult it is to get things done inside IBM. He saluted the culture. He saluted the bureaucracy. It was arguably still a big company with very ingrained, entrenched ways of doing things. But he came in and said, first of all, I've been a customer of IBM's. I'm a business guy, and I know business. I don't know mainframes. I don't know technology, but I bought a lot of technology. And leading up to Gerster coming in, as I said, he was the first non-career IBMer to come in as our CEO. Leading up, and if you think back to the time of this, if you think back to other companies like AT&T, some of the things that the old AT&T, not the new one now, that's Southwestern Bell, AT&T, Bell South AT&T. The old AT&T, AT&T was going through selling off parts of their business, Bell Labs, Western Electric, various pieces of their business, thinking that the parts are separately or worth more, etc. And IBM was on the path of breaking itself up. After the government had not known we were going to do it ourselves, Gerster basically said the last thing IBM needs to do is break itself up. We need to stay together. The perspective he brought, which is really the perspective that we have today, is perspective of that customers have business problems. And if I have a business problem in my manufacturing organization or my sales organization or some other part of my business, I need somebody to come in and help me figure out what the problem, what the solution is to that. And In many cases, there's a technology component or technology components to that solution. There may be some other things. There probably are some other components of that. Somebody needs to come and help me figure that out. He put us on a path to being a solutions-focused company. I think there was a comment made, if I remember, Mark, and I had lunch, he was refreshing my memory. There was a comment made that in the book by Carroll that, after Gerstner came on, that, IBM is never going to see the margins as a services business. You'll never see the margins that you saw previously as a mainframe business. And the answer to that is absolutely right. Our services business does not carry the margins of what our mainframe business was, or hardware today. But as a part of our solutions business, we really got into the software in a big way, which carried very significant profit margins. And we're still technology based, so we still will sell technology as a part of, in many cases, as a part of a solution. But I'll get into that a little bit more. But he was described in lots of different. Who's the Holy Terror? He brought him to save IBM, and he was the guy. And
so why was he successful? First of all, Wall Street believed him. So he got the carte blanche. He never cared about people. I mean, people were the natural victims of the process. So he's downscope, downside to attract new capital. And he said, I will not break it, because they would not allow anybody else to keep it all together. They would otherwise themselves break it apart.
He had you could describe, he had a honeymoon, but he was given a carte blanche to come in as a change agent. I mean, IBM, I don't think most people knew how perilously close to collapse we were. We were in a very severe situation. We were bleeding cash. We'd had multiple layoffs. I talked about the morale, or I talked about what it was like to be left behind, if you will. The morale was horrible. So what did he do? He really took a business approach. He took a look at our business, and what we were a series. And if you read the paper, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but if you read the paper, Globally Integrated Enterprise, we were very much a multinational, and we were a very fragmented multinational. We operated, and even today, and we have some of these designations, you have to, some for legality, but we have an IBM US, IBM Canada, IBM Mexico, IBM China, et cetera, IBM Japan. But we had, within those organizations, we were extremely fragmented. So if you think about all the things you need to run a business, there's an area that we call supply chain management. And supply chain management is very broad. It's all those processes, all those business processes from, and I'm speaking of this as almost as a straight line, as a linear set of processes, and they're not. But for simplistic sake, everything from sourcing goods and materials to make that you need as your raw materials, all the sourcing activities that go with that, all the manufacturing activities, all the distribution or logistics activities that you have within your organization, with partners, with suppliers, and then getting out to your final customer with all the products and stuff that we make. Because at the end of the day, we're still a big product company. We absolutely are still a big product company. We make a lot of stuff. And so all that supply chain. So Gerstner said, started looking at our supply chain. It was a mess. We didn't have a supply chain. We had hundreds of supply chains. He started looking at, okay, we're the world's largest IT organization. What is our cost of information technology? And I don't remember what the exact cost was, and he never could come up with a final number because I think it just kept increasing everywhere he looked. But we were, if you looked at best-in-class organizations, different types of companies, we were many times what best-in-class was from a standpoint of how much we spent on information technology. By the way, we had many what we call legacy systems running all these different disparate parts of IBM. Very expensive to do that. And so our supply chain was in a mess. For example, procurement. Most large organizations today have very sophisticated procurement or sourcing organizations. typically if you think of a manufacturer, you source basically two types of material. You source direct material, which those are the things that go into your manufacturing process. And then you source indirectly. It could be everything from pens, pencils, paper, anything that's not in the manufacturing process, travel expenses. 70–80% of our procurement professionals, if you want to call them that, before Gerstner, were focused on transactions. They were focused on administrative functions. We didn't have a chief procurement officer. We didn't have a single CIO. We didn't have a single chief supply chain officer. And so he started looking at areas where we could get very quick business return. So for example, as part of our first initiative around our supply chain transformation, it was very significant. Our supply chain effort was around procurement. Setting up a procurement organization with a real chief procurement officer looking over both direct and indirect materials that we buy, and hiring professionals who have expertise in buying those items. They're called commodity items. And so if you're used to buying literally office supplies, if you're buying travel goods, you want to have somebody who is used to negotiating with the airlines, somebody who is used to negotiating with the hotel chains, with the rental car companies, and so forth and so on. I mean, people with very specific expertise. Carrying the procurement story forward where we've gone now. So organizationally, made some very specific changes and actually made some tremendous savings. We were very much a paper-based organization. Now we're not 100%, we're all but 100% electronic. So if you're a supplier of IBM and you don't do business electronically, you're no longer a supplier. We've gone from something like 33,000 suppliers to a small fraction of that number. And we have leveraged contracts with all of our suppliers. So we have systems in place to be able to know what kind of discounts we're getting with the suppliers and have negotiating ability. Yes, sir.
Explaining to us how you streamline your supply chain of IBM, but at the same time, you have learned how to add value to your clients' supply chain and to be a choice of all of the outsourcing. You're kind of like FedEx, but is for logistics. You have become for IT.
There's been a great byproduct. Now when we were shedding, an example of that I use every day when I travel, as well as we use with clients. One is talking about our supply chain story, about how we've changed. We also learned, as we were shedding hundreds of thousands of square feet of office space, most of our employees don't have a permanent office to go to, or don't have a permanent desk or in a location. They may be assigned to Birmingham, where I live, but in most cases, some people call it hoteling. But we actually built the technology and the infrastructure for every office around the world that any of our employees, as many of them travel, they can now, we have actually created a set of technology and capability around mobility so that I can go and I can plug my laptop into our network in Bangalore, India, or China, or New York, or Birmingham. I can download the drivers for the printers in that location, have some infrastructure there. We've taken that capability and we help clients with the similar type problems now. So we've turned that into intellectual capital, intellectual property that we're able to